Oh, right. Sorry, mate, don't disturb you. Um, yeah, quite an interesting day today. Uh, I think we're pretty much done with this cookie cutter formula. Most of the work today was really to do with finalizing the way the testing is done um, using Docker. So it's replacing what was a Vagrant test system with a Docker test system now. That had some interesting implications as it turned out, uh, but nothing, particularly tragic. Okay, so the only thing left to do now really is the documentation. So I shall do that before calling it a day on this. But the next step is to actually create the Git here. It's only taken about, what, 2 or 3 weeks to get here, but anyway, right, where are we? Yes, yeah, the Docker stuff. Okay, so here's the story. It was all working basically. Okay, so you would you created the formula, and the formula when you create a formula, it comes with a sort of exemplar, just to show you where the bits go. So okay, so far so good. Then I thought to myself, okay, well, let's run the tests. So I ran the tests, and there were a couple of minor bugs. But it all seemed to be working okay. Then I thought, okay, when you run the tests for the formula normally, okay, most of the work is done in the bash script, which obviously runs in your current user context. So all the files are moved around. Then all those files are mounted, and the tests are then run within the Docker. Okay, and the first thing the test system does is relocate the files from the mounts. It just copies them, or rather, it creates symbolic links. Okay, into things like etc minion d, etc salt minion d, which configures the minion, and of course all of the stuff that goes under /srv to lay out what you want to do with salt in terms of the formula. All that works fine. So I thought, okay, well, let's try it with using the salt package manager. So what that does is it runs the Docker instance twice. The first time it uses it as a build environment. Okay, so it runs the SPM build to build the package. That then gets copied out via the bind for the volume bind. Then it runs it a second time, and this time, of course, you're not providing the formula in its native form. All you're doing is providing the result of the SPM build. Again, that all worked fine. It worked. It installed it. It ran the tests, and the tests behaved the way they were supposed to. Insofar as it doesn't install anything, because of course the formula doesn't do anything. The problem came when I then wanted to remove that test formula that I created, and of course I got all sorts of violations. And the problem was, when the SPM build is run, it creates a load of files, like for example the SPM package, and it creates a few other directories, and they are all in the bind. The problem is that inside the Docker container, you're running as root, because you probably don't need to, but it does. It runs as another user anyway, which means that when you come out of the container, any files you've created inside the container are run as another user. Now, the reason why the container itself runs as root is because normally you want salt to run as root, because of course it has to do you know, stuff like install packages and things like that, you're going to need root access anyway. So salt generally runs as root, at least on the minions. Now, so the problem was that when you came out of the Docker, all those files you created belonged to, you know, user with UID 0 root. So of course, as a normal user, you can't delete those files. You have to go and sudo or elevate your privileges to root and delete the files, which is a pain in the ass. So I thought, well, okay, how do I do this? Well, you can't just run the system as a non-root user, because when you try to do the SPM build, it wants to write to privileged directories. At least they're privileged within the context of the container, because the container is built to accommodate Salt running as a privileged user. So you can't just run them like that. So okay, you can't run it in the context of the host user. You can't. You know, there's no simple way of doing it. The only real solution that I've managed to find is for the other problem is that if you try a trick, like for example, you're inside the Docker and you say, oh, well, just chown it to some, you know, UID like 1000. It'll say, yeah, that user doesn't exist. So you go, oh, bugger. Okay, so what I have to do is when you create the Docker image, you need a user that is a non-privileged user that will be in a host, which of course you don't know because it could be anything. Now for my purposes, for the Salty Vagrants purposes, because everyone is working inside a Vagrant VirtualBox, that's all nicely controlled. We know it's going to be UID 1000 with a group ID of 1000. So in the default image, I can put a new user with UID 1000, group ID 1000, and I can then use everything as normal, running as root, do the build, create the package, blah, 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 blah. And at the very end of that, I just basically do a recursive chown on the directories I know that it's touched and convert everything back to the host user ID, the 1000, 1000. If someone wants to use this in an environment where it is not the case that the host user is going to be 1000, 1000, then they will need to build their own version of the container, which is not a big deal. I've put the Docker file alongside the formula so that users can say, okay, well, I've got the formula. I want to be able to run the tests. I can just rebuild the Docker image and specify my user UID and group ID. That way, when it's finished doing everything, it will chown those files back so that I can then manage them. Seems okay. It's an extra step for those people who aren't using my standard development environment, but it's a reasonable compromise, particularly since the Docker file itself is only really aimed at running these tests, and it is on a reasonable powered machine. It's like 2 or 3 minutes to rebuild it. It's not the end of the world, and you only need to do it once. Once you've got it, you can reuse that for every time you run the test. So it's not a big deal. But that was an interesting exercise. Yeah, so anyway, so that's it. Everything's copacetic. Like I said, it's really now just a question of writing all of that stuff in the documentation to say, you know, this is how you compensate for having a different user. So yeah, so tomorrow, apart from writing a bit of documentation, I'm ready to, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take all the work I've done refactoring this, squash it all down. It's going to make a fairly big change, but then, you know, really all I'm doing is I've effectively completely rewritten the formula actually, or the cookie cutter. But there you go. So I'm going to just squeeze it down and just say this is a complete refactoring. Drop that into master and then push it up to the repository. Then once that's done, I'll start work on Kittier, which should be fairly easy. You know, it's not a complicated installation. Right, that's it.